Hostilities with France meant that it became increasingly difficult for the UK to bring their goods to the European market, a problem which was compounded by consecutive years of failed harvests on the island. By 1803, Addington believed the kingdom had recovered enough to re-engage with France in order to improve their trading position, and once a French invasion of independent Malta seemed imminent, he used this defense of the island as a pretense for the continuation of war. In order to shore up support, Addington looked to improve relations with Russia, Prussia, and Austria, forming the Third Coalition to take on the French. Addington increased the size of the Royal Armed Forces to 600,000 men and ordered the construction of new defensive fortifications along the southern coast of Great Britain, which were called Martello Towers. Opponents of Addington, led by William Pitt the Younger within Parliament, who were in opposition of the resumption of war, teamed up and forced Henry Addington to resign, allowing Pitt to regain the premiership in 1804. For his part in managing the war with France, Pitt would institute a naval blockade on the English Channel, and with the assistance of Admiral Horatio Nelson, oversaw the decisive naval victory at the Battle of Trafalgar, which badly damaged the French and their allied Spanish fleets, further increasing the naval advantage that Britain had come to possess. The success of the coalition forces on the European continent, however, was a different story, and after several major defeats, they were forced to surrender to Napoleon. The war efforts had caused national debt to balloon to 200% of GDP. Pitt himself was deeply in debt at this point, and with the stress and frustration of the failure of the war, he began drinking increasingly heavily. William Pitt the Younger died in 1806 from a stomach ulcer caused by years of alcoholism. Common speculation was that Pitt was either homosexual or asexual, and at the time of his death, he was alone and childless. To honor his dedication and service to the kingdom, Parliament agreed to pay off his debts with taxpayer money, a debt amounting to $4.1 million when adjusted for inflation. He was followed by his cousin, William Grenville. As Prime Minister, Grenville attempted to set up a big tent coalition made up of both Tories and Whigs. In 1807, the coalition successfully abolished the slave trade amongst changing attitudes towards slavery. Other than his triumph, however, Grenville's administration failed to improve hostilities with France or expand civil rights for Catholic citizens, and he was voted out and replaced by William Cavendish, who had already previously briefly been Prime Minister. At this point, Great Britain was isolated, with its allies all being badly defeated by Napoleon and his armies, with Sweden and Austria having to surrender from the Third Coalition, thus creating the Fourth Coalition. Tensions over how to manage the war began boiling over and erupted when two members of Cavendish's cabinet publicly dueled each other over their disagreements. While neither of the duelers died, one was shot in the leg, and the ordeal was widely publicized as an indicator of how dysfunctional Cavendish's administration was. Cavendish was near the end of his life and was suffering from painful kidney stones, so he agreed to resign in 1809 and was replaced by Tory Spencer Perceval. At this point, Austria had recovered enough to rejoin the coalition, and with Russia defecting to support the French, the Fourth Coalition became the Fifth Coalition. With William Cavendish, he died shortly after his resignation due to complications related to a surgical operation to remove his kidney stones, leaving his son a large debt that necessitated the sale of various properties Cavendish had acquired during his lifetime. Spencer Perceval had served under Cavendish and was able to secure the nomination to Prime Minister after the other members of Cavendish's cabinet disqualified themselves when they had dueled. Perceval's administration was quickly handicapped when news broke of a failed military expedition known as the Walcheren Campaign, and a parliamentary investigation was launched. The expedition had sought to land on the shores of the Netherlands and march on to Antwerp in order to help the Austrian army in their fight against the French. The plan was a disaster and never really got off the ground. The British troops had first landed on the island of Walcheren off the coast of the Netherlands to organize their battalions. While camped, many of the soldiers became severely ill with an unknown sickness, taking the lives of 4,000 of them. The British were forced to turn back to Great Britain, suffering heavy casualties, essentially none related to actual fighting. The failure and a lack of response from Perceval's administration seemed to indicate that his premiership would soon come to an end. However, shortly before he could be replaced, he was walking into the House of Commons when a man named John Bellingham stepped out of the shadows and shot Perceval in the chest, killing him. Bellingham had supposedly been falsely imprisoned for years in Russia one of Britain's former allies, and therefore he demanded compensation from the British government. After several refusals, he decided he would assassinate the prime minister to exact his revenge. He refused a plea of insanity and was executed publicly by hanging. Spencer Perceval is to this day the only prime minister to be assassinated in British history, and he was followed by Robert Jenkinson in 1812. Jenkinson initially suffered a vote of no confidence, but when no better alternative could be found, he was quickly reinstated. War continued on the continent, with Prussia re-entering the fight against France, starting the Sixth Coalition. Throughout the continual warfare between the coalitions and France, the United States had chosen to stay neutral and continued to trade with the French to show gratitude for their support during the Revolution. This angered Britain, and they demanded a trade embargo between the nations. When the Americans refused to comply, the British began seizing American ships and impressing the American sailors into forced conscription. This impressment, on top of Britain's continued support of Tecumseh's Confederacy and efforts to contain the United States from expanding into the Ohio Valley, drove the United States to declare war on Britain in June, beginning the War of 1812. For the next 2 years, the United Kingdom would impose a naval blockade on the U.S., crippling their trade revenues. The Americans attempted several times to invade Upper Canada, but were repelled each time. In 1814, after 5 previous failed attempts, the Sixth Coalition finally succeeded in defeating Napoleon, which allowed the British to reallocate more troops to North America. In an act of retribution for the invasion of Upper Canada, the British marched on Washington, D.C. in August and burned most of the city to the ground, including the White House and Capitol, the only time a foreign power has ever occupied the American capital. After this defeat, however, the Americans had a series of victories, most notably under General Andrew Jackson, who repelled a major British invasion of the South at the Battle of New Orleans. While the trade embargo against the Americans was suffocating their economy, the U.S. was at this time the largest trading partner of the UK, and therefore the embargo was also being felt negatively at home. And given how the war was progressing, both sides were eager to end the conflict, and the Treaty of Ghent was signed on Christmas Eve, which restored the status quo between the nations. In 1815, Napoleon briefly escaped exile and attempted to restart his war on the European continent, necessitating the formation of the Seventh Coalition. Within 100 days, Napoleon was defeated for the second time, and with peace seemingly arriving finally, the Congress of Vienna was held to determine what the borders of Europe should look like moving forward. Following the end of the war, Parliament passed a series of strong protectionist laws to rebuild domestic production, which had been hit hard. The protectionism, unfortunately coincided with poor harvests, and this caused widespread food shortages and civil unrest. A radical leader named Thomas Spence began rallying the lower classes around the idea of reintroducing common ownership of land and universal suffrage in a movement known as Chartism. In December of 1816, followers of Spence met at Spa Fields, a park outside of London, to organize a meeting which quickly turned into a riot. The rioters attempted to march on the city and storm the Tower of London and Bank of England in hopes to topple the government, but their efforts failed and the demonstration leaders were arrested, although they were all later released. The poor weather conditions continued for the next several years, and with no increases in living standards, more Chartist riots broke out. In 1819, a crowd of protesters met in Central Public Square in Manchester to demonstrate. Jenkinson made the ill-fated decision to break the 60,000-strong protests up with a cavalry regiment, killing 18 people, in what became known as the Peterloo Massacre. Instead of responding with compassion, the government instead passed more oppressive legislation known as the Six Acts, which were as follows. First, the Unlawful Drilling Act made it illegal to organize a meeting for the purpose of weaponry or tactical training. Second, the Seizure of Arms Act allowed the government to search private property and seize any weapons found and arrest the owners of possession. Third, the Misdemeanors Act removed the use of bail from most court cases, increasing the speed at which trials would be held. The rest of the acts were more or less reaffirmations of previous laws, most notably the expansion of the stamp tax to cover not only newspapers but all written media. In reaction to the Peterloo Massacre and the Six Acts, a group of radicals met in London to devise a plan to assassinate Jenkins' cabinet and take control of the government. The plot was known as the Cato Street Conspiracy. It was uncovered before it could get off the ground, and the perpetrators were all arrested. This event shook Jenkinson, and for the next years of his administration, he became more liberal in order to appease the public. In 1827, Robert Jenkinson suffered a series of strokes and passed away. He was followed by Tory George Canning, who had been his right-hand man and was chosen as replacement by the new King George IV. Canning, who was a moderate, found it difficult to work with the more radical Tories, which made his time in office ineffective. After only 119 days in office, George Canning died from tuberculosis and was followed by Frederick Robinson. Right away, Robinson's administration was marred with dysfunction as he was unable to put together a working cabinet in a timely manner that satisfied both the radical faction of the Tories as well as the moderate faction of the Whigs. In addition, Robinson was facing trouble at home trying to care for his wife, who was suffering from severe postpartum depression following the birth of her second son. Because of all these difficulties, after only 144 days in office, Robinson tendered his resignation and was followed by Arthur Wellesley in 1828. Wellesley's first accomplishment was working with George IV to create the King's College in London as a secular higher education alternative to Oxford and Cambridge, which were both associated with the Church of England. Wellesley grew up in Ireland and was aware of the discrimination that Catholics faced, and working with the Whigs, he was able to overcome objections from the conservative Whig wing of his party to pass the Roman Catholic Relief Act of 1829, which finally granted Catholics equal civil rights by removing the previously passed penal laws. George William Finch, who was a member of the radical sect of the Tories, was outraged at the progress being made at the expense of England, and he challenged Wellesley to a duel. When the time came for the duel, both decided they could not go through with it, with Finch firing into the air and Wellesley firing off to the side. In 1830, Wellesley attended the inauguration of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, which connected the deepwater port of Liverpool to the textile manufacturing center of Manchester, being the first railroad in the world to connect two major cities. What should have been a jubilant day was overshadowed by the heckling of Wellesley for his duel and the unfortunate passing of a spectator who, confused with how the train operated, fell onto one of the tracks and was crushed to death by the passing locomotive. Major changes were coming to Britain as rapid technological advancements spurred on by capitalism were beginning to take form as the Industrial Revolution. Massive protests broke out, known as the Swing Riots, which saw farmers and workers destroy agriculture machinery to protest changes in their working conditions. The riots crippled the country, with Wellesley and the Tories taking the blame since the party had essentially held power for the last 60 years. Arthur Wellesley suffered a vote of no confidence and resigned, being followed by Whig Charles Grey. With the return of the Whigs to power, Grey was able to finally pass some progressive legislation with the Reform Act of 1832, which reformed congressional apportionment to be based on population rather than simple geography. The following year, he oversaw the abolition of slavery across the entirety of the empire. Gray worked to ban so-called truck wages, which were any form of compensation that were paid in lieu of payment using official money. One lasting aspect, which had not been covered with the Catholic emancipation, was the residents of Ireland were still being required to pay tithes to the Church of Ireland, which was the Anglican Church of Ireland, rather than to the Catholic Church, something all residents of the United Kingdom were required to do. Disagreements over how to proceed with this reform tore Gray's administration apart. Frustrated with the gridlock, Gray resigned in 1834 and was followed by fellow Whig William Lamb. William Lamb did not particularly want to be prime minister due to the extra workload it entailed, but he reluctantly agreed to the job. King George IV had been displeased by the level of progressive legislation that had been passed, and he dismissed Lamb just 4 months after he was appointed and instead placed Tory Arthur Wellesley back into the premiership. Wellesley did not want the job either and agreed to only serve as interim prime minister until the end of 1834, at which point Tory Robert Peel would serve as a permanent replacement. Peel saw the Tories as a floundering party, and in January 1835, he made his wider intentions known with the public declaration of the Tamworth Manifesto, which established a new political party called the Conservatives, which were led by Peel himself. The Conservative Party would act as a moderate party, combining centrist elements from both the Tories and the Whigs. In response, Whig leaders entered into an alliance with progressive Irish members to block all of Peel's proposals and bills, leading his administration to resign after just 100 days in office, and was followed by William Lamb, who once again would reluctantly agree to become prime minister. Lamb's second administration would be marred by a handful of scandals, most notably the public intrigue of his relationship with the beautiful socialite Caroline Norton, who had left her husband after she claimed he abused her, at which point she began her relationship with Lamb. Caroline's ex-husband sued her for adultery, but she was ultimately acquitted in court, which spared Lamb from political turmoil, although after this incident he stopped seeing Caroline due to the negative publicity. Additionally, Lamb, who was a bachelor since the death of his wife 7 years prior, was known to frequently invite women and at times underage girls over to his house for spanking-filled sexual encounters. Victoria would become the queen in 1837 and quickly became an ally with Lamb, who she saw as a mentor and father figure. That same year, widespread rebellion broke out in Upper and Lower Canada as a result of the colonists there feeling that they were not receiving fair representation for their taxation. After the riots subsided, Lamb would send the Lord Durham to Canada to observe and record the reasons for why the unrest had occurred. Durham's suggestion on how to move forward was to recognize the territories into a new united Canadian province. And in 1840, Lamb followed his suggestion by passing the British North American Act. Around this time, an ever increasing portion of the kingdom's trade revenue came from the sale of opium into China. After the Chinese expressed a desire to stop the opium trade, which was crippling their population, Lamb ordered the army to attack the Chinese to ensure free trade, beginning the First Opium War. The British easily won the war with their superior technology and received the island of Hong Kong as a consolation prize. Also that year, the Treaty of Watanagi was signed with the local Maori chiefs, which moved to establish the royal colony of New Zealand, with the understanding that the existing Maori people would continue to freely exercise their culture free from settler influence. By 1841, Lamb's escapades caught up with him, and using it as leverage, Robert Peel was able to force Lamb to resign and once again take power under the Canoe Conservative Party.